Hey, what's up? So this video is a compilation of some TikTok videos that I produced a little bit ago, exploring Saint Francis of Assisi through a trans lens. Quite a few people found these videos interesting and informative, so I thought that I would put them all together on YouTube to reach folks here. The main resource I drew from for these videos and that I highly recommend is Kittredge Cherry's Q-Spirit article about St. Francis. I'll make sure to link it in the show notes, and I'll also include some other links to resources that I recommend, including Trans and Genderqueer Subjects in Medieval Hagiography, which is a wonderful text that came out just a couple years ago and explores a bunch of medieval saints and nuns, monks, eunuchs, all these great folks who can be viewed through a trans lens. I also will link my own website where I talk about various historical figures throughout Christian history through a trans lens. So yeah, lots of places you can go to learn more, but first here are these videos about St. Francis and a lot of his followers. First Monday of Lent, I figured that this week I would focus on Francis and start with how very queer Francis is. Francis was born in the 1100s to a wealthy Italian family, and he lived the high life until certain experiences caused him to renounce his inheritance and live life in poverty. He saw himself as following in the footsteps of Jesus, who, after all, was an itinerant preacher who relied on others' hospitality. In a world that lifts up wealth and material gain as success, choosing poverty is subversive, and in that way it is queer. Fast forward a little bit, and Francis has gained the Pope's support and started a monastery where he instructs his friars to call him Mother Francis. He frequently connected himself to Jesus' own self-identification as a mother hen, with chicks sheltering under her wings. Francis encouraged all of his friars to imagine themselves as mothers. His first rule instructs each monk to love and care for his brother as a mother loves and cares. Mother Francis believed that we are all mothers of Christ when we carry him in our heart and give birth to him through holy activity. Franciscan scholar Kevin Alphick writes about a vision Francis once had in which God affirms this use of feminine language. Francis is walking along a road when three women suddenly greet him, "Welcome, Lady Poverty." These three women represent the Trinity, the God who is three in one. In naming Francis Lady Poverty, God sees and honors Francis for all that he is. God does not rebuke Francis's self-identification with feminine language, but rather encourages it by gifting him with yet another feminine title. And they do so while appearing as an all-female Trinity. Perhaps by appearing thus, God suggests to Francis, "Your fluidity is beautiful. I too hold femininity and masculinity within me, and everything beyond and in between." Tomorrow I'll continue with more stories of the queerness of Francis and how he enabled gender nonconformity among his followers. First Tuesday of Lent, let's talk more about St. Francis of Assisi, the medieval friar who called himself Mother Francis and whom God named Lady Poverty. Today I'll share a few examples of women who followed Francis and how Francis played around with gender to let them in. The most famous of these women is St. Clare of Assisi, who came to Francis when all of his followers were still all male. He tonsured her, gave her that super sexy haircut that's all bald on top with hair on the sides that you see on medieval monks. Next we have Jacoba of Sedisoli, which I'm probably saying wrong. She was a wealthy noblewoman who was also drawn to Francis. He convinced her to stay with her family, which included two sons, rather than joining the hardcore, full poverty mode of Franciscan living. But when Francis was on his deathbed, he sent for Jacoba to bring him some of his favorite almond treats. She came, and at first the friars were like, "We can't let her in here, this is a boys-only monastery." But Francis replied, Blessed be God, who has guided the Lady Jacoba, our brother, to us. Open the door and bring her in, for our brother Jacoba does not have to observe the decree against women. Jacoba came, and she stayed with Francis until he died. Finally, we have my personal fave, Madre Juana de la Cruz. She lived several centuries after Francis in Spain, during the Spanish Inquisition, no less, when the Catholic Church cracked down on anything they deemed unorthodox. Yet they could not deny Juana's visions that played with God's gender, perhaps in part because they could trace those visions back to Francis's own teachings. Juana also understood herself to contain masculinity as well as femininity. She claimed that she had originally been male in the womb, but reshaped as female before being born. Franciscan scholar Kevin Elphick affirms Juana as a medieval model for modern LGBTQ people, exemplifying radical authenticity to the queer and holy truth of her own identity. Juana's gender combined masculinity and femininity, and she proclaimed the presence of God she found inherent in that identity. It's the second Wednesday of Lent, and I have another video for y'all about the queerness of Francis of Assisi. In the last two videos, I talked about his creativity with gender and how that inspired his followers. Now I'm going to talk about the man whom Francis loved more than any other. When Francis renounced his wealthy life of luxury, only one person followed him into his new life of poverty, and that wasn't anyone from his family, that was this friend of his. The earliest biographer of Francis, Thomas of Celano, who knew him personally and published it just a few years after Francis's death, wrote this. Now there was a man in the city of Assisi whom Francis loved more than any other, and since they were of the same age, and their constant association and ties of affection emboldened Francis to share his secret with him, he would often take his friend off to secluded spots where they could discuss private matters, and tell him that he had chanced upon a great and precious treasure. His friend was delighted, and, intrigued by what he heard, he gladly accompanied Francis wherever he asked. There was a cave near Assisi where the two friends often went to talk about this treasure. This intimate friend followed Francis even into poverty. He is unnamed in Celano's biography, but Elphick and other scholars believe that he may be the same person as Brother Elias of Cortona, whom Celano writes about later, and whom Celano also describes as being intimately close to Francis. While Francis encouraged all his followers to call him mother, he called Elias mother, which symbolized Francis's trust and reliance on Elias. As Francis was dying, he offered Elias a unique blessing, and Elias read to him from the part of the Gospel of John that introduces Jesus' own beloved disciple. Celano reminds us that Elias is the one whom Francis loved, using the same Latin verb for love there that is used in the Vulgate to describe Jesus' love for his beloved disciple. After Francis has died, Elias is grief-stricken. In a letter to all of the Franciscans, he acknowledges that this is a loss for all, yet it is a trial singularly my own. There is something unique in Elias's grief for Francis. Interestingly enough, future biographies about Francis write Elias out of the story. I just can't imagine why the church would write out Francis's most beloved companion unless, it's the second Friday of Lent, and it's time for more stuff about Francis of Assisi, this time about his queer relationship with God. While in the present day, there are some people who will get all up in a tizzy if you call God mother instead of father, Francis was perfectly comfortable with that all the way back in the 13th century. In his 1979 biography, Ignacio Larrañaga explores how Francis didn't conceive of God as male and didn't describe God as father, maybe in part because of his bad relationship with his own human father. This word, father, meant little to him, and subconsciously evoked the figure of an egotistical, domineering man who lingers in the darkest memories of his life. Instead, Francis experienced God in androgynous or feminine terms, like the all-female Trinity I discussed in my first Francis video, which impacted how he understood humans as made in God's image. He saw each person as both a brother and a sister, saw himself as a mother, understood that each person, like God, carries both masculinity and femininity within them. Let's zoom in on his relationship with one person of the Trinity, in particular, Jesus. I don't think it's going too far to say that Francis was in love with Christ, that he loved Christ deeply and extremely intimately. He even describes visions of being breastfed by Christ, and if that sounds bizarre to you, let it be known that Francis was not the first medieval Christian to connect the way that Christ literally feeds his followers his own flesh and blood through the Eucharist with the way that nursing mothers breastfeed their babies. It was also common to link Christ's side wound with the genitals out of which babies are born. Christ is the mother who gave birth to the church out of his own side wound. Take that idea and then look at paintings of Francis getting up close and personal with that side wound. Yeah. Francis was passionate about Christ's passion, his agony on the cross at the hands of Roman powers. Francis identified so closely with Christ's pain, in fact, that in 1224, 40-something-year-old Francis received the Stigmata. The crucifixion wounds miraculously appeared in his own hands, feet, and side, making Francis the first recorded example of someone receiving the Stigmata. Tomorrow, I'll share a poem by Jim Wise that explores this experience through a homoerotic lens. It's the second Saturday of Lent. Yesterday, I explored how Francis was so passionate about Christ that he became the first person to receive the Stigmata, and I promised to share a poem that explores the homoerotic elements of that experience. But first, let me share a little bit from the account of Brother Leo, who witnessed Francis receiving the Stigmata in 1224. Leo describes the heavens exploding and splashing forth all their glory in millions of waterfalls of colors and stars, and a fiery figure with flaming wings flashing down to hover above Francis. This fiery being is Jesus. Jesus speaks, and then his wounds stream out fire and blood that pierce Francis's hands and feet as well as his heart. Leo writes, as Francis uttered a mighty shout of joy and pain, the fiery image impressed itself into his body, as into a mirrored reflection of itself, with all its love, its beauty, and its grief, and it vanished within him. Another cry pierced the air. Then, with nails and wounds through his body, and with his soul and spirit aflame, Francis sank down unconscious. So yeah, this figure impressed itself into Francis's body. Love and joy is mingled with pain. There is this ecstatic wounding, and then Francis is so spent that he collapses unconscious. It's sensual stuff. So here is the first half of Jim Wise's poem, Stigmata. If you want to read the full thing, I recommend searching for Q Spirit's article on Francis of Assisi, and you'll find a link to the poem there. Pierced by Christ, the great penetration only a God can give. Assisi boy Francis was the first, you know. Out of all the pious faithful, out of all the priests and monks and friars and whispering mystics who cruised Christ down the centuries, it took a beggar boy dressed out in a rough habit, singing songs to the sun and moon to catch the Messiah's eye. Francesco, Saint Francis, that beloved of the lover who was love itself in human form. Christ loves everyone, so we're told, and so we believe, but the Stigmata is proof that Christ, like most of us, has a type. He may love everyone, but his sacred lust is reserved for barefoot hippie boys who live life wild and free, who don't clutter their brief lives with things and stuff and junk, who always keep a backpack near the door just in case the spirit moves. It is the second Sunday of Lent, and it is time for one more video about the queerness of Francis of Assisi, the medieval monk who rejected the wisdom of the world that success is measured in material gain in favor of poverty, who envisioned God as an all-female Trinity and himself as mother to his followers, whose intimacy with Christ was so passionate that he received the stigmata, the crucifixion wounds pressed into his own hands and feet and side. Something about the word stigmata. It's the plural form of the Greek word stigma, which simply means mark, but of course in English it has a deeper meaning. To be stigmatized is to be branded as shameful, inferior, immoral. Francis truly embraced all the stigma of the world throughout his life, including his deep love for the most reviled outcasts of his time, as Kittredge Cherry writes in her article on Francis on qspirit.net. While many medieval Europeans connected leprosy to sexual sin, lechery, adultery, and sodomy, and shunned lepers out of disgust and fear, Francis saw the face of Christ in them. He did not fear getting close and personal with them in order to care for them. Catholic priest and artist William Hart McNichols connected Francis's care for lepers to the AIDS crisis of the late 20th century. In his painting, St. Francis 'Neath the Bitter Tree, he depicts Christ hung on a cross, proclaiming him as an AIDS leper, drug user, and homosexual. Francis reaches up to embrace this utterly stigmatized Christ, and the look the two men share is full of tenderness. I hope you've enjoyed learning about the queerness of St. Francis. As we enter a new week of Lent, I invite you to ponder with me, how can we embrace the most stigmatized outcast of our times, recognizing the face of God in them? How do we let go of our internalized biases and our fear of social judgment in order to show the hated and despised the tenderness of Francis?